Take lunch last. You're the least valuable here. The words cut through the office like a blade, and I felt every pair of eyes in the room turn toward me. My face burned as I stared down at my desk, fingers trembling over the keyboard. The humiliation was complete. 34 years old, reduced to nothing in front of my colleagues by Greg Halden's casual cruelty. The silence stretched on, suffocating me. Then the office door burst open. "There she is, my miracle worker," boomed a familiar voice. Samuel Hartman, CEO of our biggest client, strode in with a wide smile, looking directly at me. "My name is Fiona Marshall, and 6 months ago, I thought my career was over. After 8 years as a senior financial analyst at Granville Partners, I watched my entire department get gutted in what they called strategic restructuring. Translation: they needed to cut costs, and experienced employees like me were too expensive to keep around. At 34, starting over felt like admitting defeat. But bills don't pay themselves, and my savings account was hemorrhaging faster than I could find new opportunities. That's how I ended up at Halden and Bryce Associates, a mid-tier financial consulting firm that felt like a significant step backward from my previous position. Greg Halden hired me himself. All smiles and promises during the interview. "We need someone with your expertise," he'd said, shaking my hand with practiced enthusiasm. "Fresh perspective, proven track record, you're exactly what we're looking for." What he failed to mention was that he had no intention of actually using that expertise. From day one, Greg made it clear that despite my qualifications, I was starting at the bottom of his carefully constructed hierarchy. While I'd previously managed million-dollar portfolios and led strategic planning sessions, here I was, relegated to data entry and basic spreadsheet maintenance. Tasks that a recent graduate could handle with their eyes closed. "You need to learn our systems first," Greg would say whenever I asked about taking on more substantial work. Every company has its own way of doing things. But weeks turned into months, and the learning period never seemed to end. The worst part wasn't the menial work, it was watching Greg systematically exclude me from anything meaningful. Important client meetings? "Not yet, you're not ready for that level of responsibility." Strategic planning sessions? "We need people who understand our culture first." Budget reviews? "Maybe next quarter, when you've proven yourself." Meanwhile, he'd pile on additional tasks, then criticize the results. Nothing was ever good enough. My reports were too detailed or not comprehensive enough. My timelines were unrealistic or lacking urgency. It was a masterclass in professional gaslighting, designed to keep me questioning my own competence. The message was crystal clear. I was there to do the grunt work while the real professionals, all of whom happened to be men, handled the important stuff. Greg had hired me for my credentials, then systematically worked to undermine my confidence and keep me in my place. I should have seen the pattern sooner. This wasn't about learning company culture or proving myself. This was about control. Greg needed someone with my skills to handle the technical work. But he couldn't stomach the idea of a woman, especially one more qualified than half his existing team, threatening his position as the indispensable expert. So I kept my head down, did the work, and waited for my chance to prove him wrong. The opportunity came in the form of Hartman Industrial Group, our most crucial client. They represented nearly 40% of our company's revenue, and their CEO, Samuel Hartman, had built his manufacturing empire through shrewd financial decisions and zero tolerance for incompetence. When Hartman needed a comprehensive financial restructuring plan, Greg jumped at the chance to showcase his expertise. "This is big league stuff," Greg announced during our team meeting, his chest puffed with self-importance. "Hartman trusts us with their most sensitive financial data. I'll be handling the strategic components personally, of course." His eyes swept the room before landing on me with that familiar, condescending smile. "Fiona, you'll be doing the supporting number crunching, data validation, basic calculations, right in your wheelhouse." I bit my tongue. Data validation. As if I hadn't spent years developing complex financial models that had saved my previous company millions. But I nodded and accepted the assignment, knowing that arguing would only give Greg more ammunition for his next performance review. The project consumed 3 weeks of 18-hour days. While Greg held flashy presentations and schmoozing sessions, I lived in spreadsheets, building the mathematical foundation that would support his strategic recommendations. The numbers were intricate, interconnected, and absolutely critical to get right. One miscalculation could cascade into catastrophic losses for Hartman's restructuring efforts. On the final night before our presentation, I was running through my quality checks when something made my blood run cold. Deep in the financial model, hidden beneath layers of calculations, I found a fundamental error in Greg's depreciation assumptions. The mistake was subtle but devastating. It underestimated equipment devaluation by nearly 30%. If implemented, Greg's recommendations would cost Hartman Industrial Group somewhere between $8 and $12 million over the next 5 years. I stared at the screen, my coffee growing cold as the implications sank in. This wasn't just a simple mistake, it was the kind of error that destroyed careers and ended client relationships. Greg had been so focused on impressing Hartman with his strategic vision that he'd rushed through the foundational work, leaving massive gaps in his analysis. Without hesitation, I dove back into the model. The clock showed 11:47 p.m., and our presentation was scheduled for 9 a.m. I had less than 10 hours to rebuild 3 weeks of work, but there was no choice. I couldn't let this mistake go forward with my name attached to it, even in a supporting role. I worked through the night, reconstructing the entire depreciation schedule, stress testing the assumptions, and running scenario analyses to ensure accuracy. By 6 a.m., I had a corrected model that would actually serve Hartman's interests instead of bankrupting them. But instead of going through Greg, I made a decision that would change everything. I sent the corrected analysis directly to Hartman's CFO, along with a detailed explanation of the issues I'd identified and the solutions I'd implemented. The email was professional, thorough, and completely bypassed Greg's authority. I never told Greg what I'd done. As far as he knew, everything was proceeding according to his original plan. 3 weeks later, the thank you letter arrived. It was printed on official Hartman Industrial Group letterhead, signed by Samuel Hartman himself, and addressed to the exceptional team at Halden and Bryce Associates. The letter praised our innovative approach and meticulous attention to detail, specifically highlighting how our recommendations had identified potential cost savings that will strengthen our competitive position for years to come. Greg's reaction was swift and predictable. Within an hour of receiving the letter, he had it laminated and prominently displayed in the break room, right next to the coffee machine, where everyone would see it multiple times a day. He made sure to position himself nearby during lunch breaks, ready to accept congratulations and bask in the reflected glory of Hartman's praise. This is what happens when you have the right person leading a project, he told anyone who would listen. Experience matters. You can't just throw junior analysts at complex problems and expect results. His eyes would find me across the room during these impromptu victory speeches, a slight smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. The irony was suffocating. Every word of praise in that letter was earned through my sleepless nights and mathematical precision. Yet Greg soaked up the recognition like he'd personally saved Hartman from financial ruin. My colleagues nodded along, offering their congratulations to Greg while treating me with the same polite indifference they always had. Nice work on the Hartman project, my desk neighbor, Marcus, said one morning, but his tone was perfunctory, the kind of comment you make to someone who fetched coffee for the real heroes. He had no idea that I'd rebuilt the entire financial foundation of the project, just as none of them knew that Greg's original model would have been a disaster. The status quo remained unchanged. Despite the project's success, Greg continued to assign me mundane tasks well below my capabilities. Data entry, basic spreadsheet formatting, routine compliance checks, busy work designed to keep me occupied while he handled the strategic responsibilities. When I suggested taking on more complex assignments, he would wave me off with practiced dismissiveness. "You're not quite ready for that level of responsibility," he'd say. "The Hartman project was a good start, but you need to prove you can handle the fundamentals consistently before we move you up to client-facing work." Client-facing work. The phrase stung because I knew the truth. I had been the one interfacing with Hartman's CFO, providing the analysis and recommendations that had earned us that glowing letter. But Greg had positioned himself as the sole point of contact in all official communications, effectively erasing my contributions from the record. My colleagues continued to view me as the junior member of the team, someone who might eventually work her way up to more meaningful assignments if she proved herself over time. They had no reason to think otherwise. Greg had carefully crafted a narrative where he was the brilliant strategist and I was merely a competent assistant who helped with the number crunching. The laminated letter mocked me every time I walked past it, a constant reminder of how easily credit could be stolen and rewritten. But it also served as motivation. I had saved Greg from professional catastrophe, and he had repaid me with dismissal and condescension. I wouldn't make that mistake again. The formal warning came on a Tuesday morning, delivered with Greg's trademark, passive-aggressive smile. He slid the HR document across his desk like he was doing me a favor, his expression a careful mix of disappointment and condescension. "This is difficult for me, Fiona. But we need to address some serious concerns about your professional conduct," he began, his voice dripping with fake concern. "Specifically, your unauthorized communication with clients outside established protocols." I stared at the paper, my hands steady despite the rage building in my chest. The warning cited my direct contact with Hartman Industrial Group's financial team as a violation of company policy, claiming I had circumvented proper channels and potentially compromised client relationships through unprofessional conduct. "You contacted Hartman's CFO without clearance," Greg continued, leaning back in his chair with satisfaction. "That's a serious breach of protocol. All client communications must go through department heads, that's me, to ensure consistency and professionalism." The hypocrisy was staggering. This was the same man who had just spent 3 weeks basking in praise for work I had essentially completed solo. The same man whose careless mistakes would have cost our biggest client millions of dollars. Now he was punishing me for preventing that disaster. "I identified critical errors in the financial model," I said quietly. "Errors that would have caused significant losses for Hartman. I felt it was my responsibility to—" "Your responsibility," Greg interrupted, "is to follow the chain of command. If you had concerns, you should have brought them to me first. Instead, you went behind my back and made me look incompetent in front of our most important client." The irony wasn't lost on me. I had made him look competent by fixing his mistakes, but he was too insecure to acknowledge that reality. In his mind, my competence was a direct threat to his authority. "This is your official warning," he said, tapping the document. "Any further violations of company protocol will result in immediate termination. Are we clear?" I signed the paper because I had no choice. But that night, something fundamental shifted inside me. I went home to my small apartment and did something I should have done months ago. I started documenting everything. I pulled out a notebook and began writing down every instance of Greg's professional sabotage. The qualified projects he'd reassigned at the last minute, the meetings he'd excluded me from without explanation, the credit he'd stolen for my work, the condescending comments made in front of colleagues, the systematic undermining of my confidence and capabilities. Page after page filled with evidence of his pattern of behavior, not just toward me, but toward anyone who might threaten his position. I realized I wasn't his first victim. I was just the most recent. But as I wrote, I also made a decision that would change everything. I was done saving Greg from his own incompetence. If he wanted to take credit for my work, then he could also take responsibility for his mistakes. The next time he made an error, and there would be a next time, I wouldn't be there to catch him. Meanwhile, I began cultivating relationships with our key clients through official channels. Hartman's team had already requested me specifically for follow-up questions about the restructuring project. Other clients began asking for me by name when they needed detailed analysis. I was careful to keep Greg informed, to follow proper protocols, but I made sure these relationships were built on my competence, not his filtered version of it. The game was changing, and this time, I intended to win. The quarterly company meeting arrived with all the fanfare Greg loved. He'd spent weeks preparing his presentation, a glossy showcase of departmental achievements that painted him as the mastermind behind our recent successes. The conference room was packed with senior leadership, department heads, and key staff, exactly the audience Greg craved. I'm proud to report that our client satisfaction scores have reached an all-time high, Greg announced, clicking through slides filled with glowing testimonials and impressive metrics. Our strategic approach to relationship management has resulted in unprecedented client retention and expanded project scopes. He paused at a slide featuring the Hartman letter, now blown up to poster size. This feedback from our largest client exemplifies the level of service we deliver when projects are managed with proper oversight and expertise. I sat in the back row, watching Greg bask in applause for work that had cost me countless sleepless nights. But this time, I wasn't seething with helpless anger. This time, I was prepared. The key to our success, Greg continued, has been my hands-on approach to client communications. By maintaining direct relationships with decision-makers, I ensure that our recommendations align perfectly with their strategic objectives. That's when Andrew Locke, our CEO, raised his hand. Greg, I'm curious about something. I was at the industry conference last month, and I ran into Samuel Hartman. When I mentioned your name, he looked confused, said he'd never heard of you. The room fell silent. Greg's confident smile faltered for just a moment before he recovered. Well, you know how these executive types are. They work through their CFOs and financial teams. Actually, Andrew interrupted, that's what was interesting. He knew exactly who Fiona Marshall was. Said she was the best analyst he'd worked with in years. Called her his miracle worker. Strange that he'd know a junior team member, but not the department head, don't you think? Every head in the room turned toward me. I felt Greg's eyes burning into me, but I kept my expression neutral, professional. This wasn't my doing. This was simply the truth finally catching up with his lies. I'm sure there's been some miscommunication, Greg stammered. Client relationships are complex, and different team members interact with different levels of... I made some calls after that conversation, Andrew continued, his voice cutting through Greg's excuses. Turns out most of our major clients have the same story. They know Fiona. They request her specifically. But they've never actually worked directly with you. Greg, how do you explain that? The silence stretched on, suffocating. Greg's face had gone pale, and I could see him frantically trying to construct a plausible explanation. But there wasn't one. The truth was simple. While he'd been taking credit and giving presentations, I'd been doing the actual work that kept our clients satisfied. In fact, Andrew said, standing up, I think this situation calls for some organizational changes. Effective immediately. We're creating a new client relations department. Fiona, I'd like you to head up this division. You'll report directly to me, and you'll have full authority over all client communications and project management. The room erupted in murmurs. Greg's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. After months of being dismissed and marginalized, I was being promoted over the man who had tried to destroy my career. Greg, you'll be transitioning to a supporting role during this restructuring. We'll discuss the details privately. Justice, it turned out, tasted exactly like I'd imagined it would. The transition period was designed to be temporary, but Andrew made it clear that Greg would be working under my supervision for the foreseeable future. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. The man who had spent months telling me I wasn't ready for responsibility now had to report to me daily. Greg's first week in his new role was a masterclass in barely controlled rage. He sat through my team meetings with clenched jaw and white knuckles, his face a mask of professional composure that fooled no one. When I assigned him tasks, legitimate, important work, not the busy work he'd given me, he completed them with mechanical efficiency, never quite meeting my eyes. This is temporary, he said during one of our one-on-one meetings, his voice tight with suppressed fury. You know that, right? Andrew's just making a point. Once things settle down, the natural order will reassert itself. I looked at him across my new desk, the same desk where he'd handed me that formal warning just weeks ago. The natural order, I repeated carefully. You mean the order where you take credit for other people's work while contributing nothing of value yourself? His mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the raw hatred underneath. You have no idea what you're dealing with. Fiona, I've been in this business for 15 years. I have connections you can't even imagine. This little power trip of yours won't last long. Is that a threat, Greg? It's a reality check. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. You think you're clever, but you're just a glorified number cruncher who got lucky. When this all falls apart, and it will, you'll come crawling back, begging for my help. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out a file folder. Inside were copies of every email, every performance review, every instance of documented misconduct I'd been collecting for months. Greg, I'm going to give you two options. You can continue working under my supervision with the professionalism this company expects, or you can accept the severance package that HR has already prepared. His eyes widened as he saw the thickness of the file. You've been documenting everything, every condescending comment, every stolen credit, every attempt to undermine my work. Did you know that keeping detailed records of workplace harassment is considered a best practice? HR was very interested in my documentation. The color drained from his face. That's not harassment, that's just management. A pattern of behavior designed to create a hostile work environment for a qualified employee based on gender bias? That's exactly what harassment looks like. Greg, and I have witnesses. I closed the file and looked at him directly. The severance package is generous. 6 months' salary, full benefits, and a neutral reference. But it expires at the end of this week. After that, you'll be working for me indefinitely. And I promise you, I'm a much more demanding boss than you ever were. Greg stared at me for a long moment, his face cycling through anger, disbelief, and finally defeat. He had built his career on intimidating people who couldn't fight back, but he'd never learned how to handle someone who refused to be intimidated. You think you've won, he said quietly. I know I have. I stood up, signaling the end of our meeting. Let me know your decision by Friday. Until then, I need those client reports on my desk by 5. He left my office without another word, and I never saw him again after that Friday. 6 months later, my new department had exceeded every performance metric Andrew had set. Client satisfaction scores reached unprecedented highs. Project completion rates improved by 30%. And most importantly, we'd secured 3 major new contracts that Greg's old approach never could have landed. The transformation wasn't just about numbers. It was about respect. Clients knew they were getting direct access to the people actually doing the work, not filtered through layers of ego and incompetence. My team thrived in an environment where competence was rewarded rather than threatened, where good ideas were implemented regardless of who suggested them. Samuel Hartman became one of my strongest advocates, referring 2 additional manufacturing companies to our firm. Finally, someone who understands that business is about results, not politics. He told Andrew during a dinner meeting, Fiona's the reason we're expanding our relationship with your company. But the real validation came when Greg resurfaced at Valden Consulting, our primary competitor. Word travels fast in our industry, and I heard through mutual contacts that he'd been hired as a senior partner, promising to bring his established client relationships with him. His first move was predictable. He reached out to Hartman Industrial Group, offering them a better deal and more experienced management. The meeting lasted exactly 20 minutes. Samuel's assistant called me afterward, laughing about how Greg had spent the entire time talking about projects he'd never actually worked on, using terminology he clearly didn't understand. Mr. Hartman asked him to explain the depreciation model adjustments from last year's restructuring, she told me. The man went completely blank. It was painful to watch. Greg's tenure at Valden lasted 4 months. His inability to deliver on his promises, combined with his toxic management style, made him a liability they couldn't afford. Last I heard, he was working for a small firm in Phoenix, far from the network of clients who knew his reputation. Meanwhile, my department continued to grow. Andrew promoted me to Vice President of Client Relations, and I now oversee a team of 12 talented analysts who actually enjoy coming to work. We've built a culture where expertise is valued over politics, where credit is shared rather than hoarded, and where the best ideas win regardless of who presents them. Sometimes I think about that moment in the break room when Greg told me to take lunch last because I was the least valuable member of the team. The memory still stings, but it also serves as a reminder of how far I've come. From being dismissed as a glorified number cruncher to running the most successful department in the company, all because I refused to let someone else's insecurity define my worth. The best revenge, I learned, isn't getting even, it's getting better. Thank you for listening to this story of workplace justice and personal triumph. I'd love to hear from you. Where are you listening to this story? Are you dealing with a similar situation at work? Or do you have your own revenge story to share? Please leave a comment below, subscribe to the channel, and let me know your thoughts. Your experiences and insights make these stories even more meaningful.